I've been getting a lot of questions about importing cars to the US, so instead of explaining the importation process over and over, I figured I'd create a video to explain it. I'll try to be as thorough as I can using my own experience. I'll go through the process of buying a car in Europe, getting it shipped, how much it costs, what to look out for, and other tips from my own experience. I'm not sure if I'm doing it the easiest or cheapest way possible, but it's what I did and it worked for me. In 2020, I was living in Germany, so I took this opportunity to go shopping for something that was not available in the US. I knew I wanted a BMW wagon, preferably an Alpina, and the car had to be nearly 25 years old or older because of the 25-year rule. In the US, a car that is imported must meet US crash safety standards unless it is 25 years old. Emission systems must also meet US standards for anything newer than 21 years old. For all intents and purposes, it's 25 years in order to easily get a car into the US. You can have a car federalized so it meets US standards, but it's not always possible and is an expensive proposition. I am not going to cover that. There's also a really good article on Auto Week on the background of the 25-year rule. The sites I used include mobile.de and autoscout24.de. Just like any other car listing site, I contacted several sellers and looked at a few cars near where I was living. People are nicer if you at least try to speak their language, and having lived in Europe before, I knew how Europeans react to Americans who don't even try to be sensitive to local norms or customs. Just don't be that person. I was okay writing and reading German, so initial email communications worked very easily. I was upfront that I was American and that my German wasn't the best. Some sellers won't want to deal with someone who doesn't speak German natively because of the fear of misunderstanding or miscommunication when negotiating. Respect their decision and just move on. The first car that I bought and imported, I did it while I was living in Germany, and the second car I bought while I was in Europe for vacation. It doesn't really matter or make a difference. It's just like buying a car remotely. In terms of what to look for, it's really the same as if you were buying a car in the US. Since I was looking at older cars, inspect it for rust. Almost every car I looked at in Europe had rust in some form on the body. Be familiar with the common rust issues or rust areas of the car models you're looking at. Since I was looking at E36 wagons mostly, it's the rear wheel arches, the rear hatch, the edges of the doors, and then you can certainly look at the plating on the brake calipers to give a good indication of how much salt the car has been exposed to. I'm not aware of any Carfax equivalent in Europe, so you're kind of on your own to inspect a car for crash damage if the seller doesn't disclose it. Look at things like edges of the panels, look at lines where paint blending might be common, look for plastic or rubber or just screws where there may be some paint overspray, look for consistency in the paint as well. Use a paint depth meter to check for consistency between panels. The chances of a roof being damaged in a crash and repaired is low, so you can use that as a good baseline on what the paint thickness should be. Just know that horizontal surfaces will have slightly thicker paint than vertical surfaces for obvious reasons. You can also arrange for a pre-purchase inspection, just like buying a car in the US. I opted not to do that since I knew a 25-year-old car was going to have issues and I was going to sort out many things myself. So I personally did not organize a pre-purchase inspection. So while I was living in Europe in 2020, I found my 96 Alpina B3 3.2 Touring in the Netherlands via an online advert. It was from a private collector of German and American cars. He had a really cool facility and a number of Alpinas and BMW wagons. He was also a dealership, so he helped me handle the paperwork to get the car registered in my name with an export license plate for 2 weeks and insurance. In the Netherlands, the registration certificate includes a smart card. I was able to get it set up with my name and US address since I was exporting the car. The safety inspection in the Netherlands is called an APK, which dealership is on the hook for before it can be registered to a new owner. If the seller wasn't a dealership, we would have done the same thing and just gone to a registration office to handle the paperwork. Unfortunately, there didn't appear to be an option to have an export plate for more than 2 weeks from the Netherlands. So I only really had the car for 2 weeks in Germany to enjoy before I had to drop it off at the port. Fast forward almost a year into 2021, I had already moved back to the US and my B3 had already arrived stateside. In late 2021, I was actually traveling back to Germany for a few weeks of vacation, and while I was on vacation, I had a lead on another car in Germany. It was my dream car, an Alpina B8 4.6 Touring. See my other video for an overview of that car. Rare cars are usually sold privately, so I had been engaging on some German internet forums and car clubs regarding my B3. I had mentioned in a post many months ago about the B8 being my dream car. Several B8 owners actually reached out to me to see if I was interested in their car, but they were all convertibles or coupes. Eventually, the owner of a B8 4.6 Touring did reach out to me. We discussed the car and we agreed to meet up while I was in Germany for vacation. I obviously ended up buying the car. The registration certificate in Germany comes in two parts. Part one stays with the car while you're driving, similar to a registration document that you keep in the car or your wallet. Part two is stored safely somewhere else and acts like a title to the car. Part two actually notes how many previous owners a car has, but dealerships do count as an owner, so those numbers can look inflated if a car has passed hands through several dealerships. A visit to the registration office is how you transfer ownership officially to kind of get the registration certificate in your name. There are shops next door to the registration office that actually make the license plate, including the export license plate that will allow you to drive the car for a certain amount of time before it's exported. Insurance is also purchased at these shops. Just be very clear what country you need insurance for, as some smaller towns may get confused when you start talking about exporting the car, and they're going to assume you may want to buy insurance coverage for the U.S. After buying the plate and insurance, you basically walk back to the registration office to finalize the process. If you're buying from a dealership, they will usually help sort everything out. If you're buying from a private party seller, be prepared to ask the seller for help with the registration office or have a local friend that understands the registration process to help out. The registration fees are very reasonable and nothing like U.S. states that charge almost a sales tax equivalent amount. So that is a very cheap component of this whole process. Purchasing from a dealership in Germany also includes some nuances one should be aware of when negotiating. German law requires that dealerships include a warranty for any car they sell. Now, I'm not 100% sure what such a warranty is supposed to include, but I believe it has to cover safety and emissions related items for 1 year. If you're exporting the car immediately or shortly afterwards, there's no real need for a warranty. As a result, you can use that as a negotiating tactic to skip on the warranty. For specialty or rarer cars, I found that dealerships avoid having to deal with warranty or even sales tax by selling client cars on consignment. Every older BMW M car or Alpina car that I looked at a dealership was being sold on consignment, with the transaction between the buyer and the owner, and the dealership just being there to facilitate and broker the deal. To export the car from Europe, I had a shipping company lined up to help. A few things were needed for the export process. Number one, you need a bill of sale. U.S. Customs will only accept documents in English, so just keep that in mind. For both purchases, I had English bill of sales prepared. ADAC, or the German Auto Club, has a great English bill of sale template that basically mimics what every German is accustomed to in terms of a bill of sale. Number two, I believe this is optional since not everyone's going to title the car in Europe before exporting, but the title should also be in English. So be prepared to get a translation done or ask the shipping company to facilitate that for you. My Dutch title for my B3 was also in English, so nothing was needed. I could have just submitted it as is. However, my German title for the B8 was only in German, and I had the shipping company take care of that for me. Number three, you'll need some type of documentation to ascertain the age of the car. Since I was importing the car into the US under the 25-year rule, I wanted to make sure I had something to demonstrate the age of the car if the car ended up being physically inspected by customs. This was probably unnecessary or overkill, but I didn't want to take the chance. In Europe, I found that registration certificates generally include a first registered field, so you can use that as documentation. The shipping cost for my purchase of my B3 in 2020 was very reasonable. For my B8 purchased in 2021, the shipping cost was over double due to the shipping issues arising from the pandemic as well as the Suez Canal blockage. Shop around to find the best rate with a shipper that has experience with specialty cars. I would only recommend shared container shipping as it's safer for the car, and you're allowed to place items inside the car during shipment, such as spare parts acquired while I was overseas on ebay.de or something. A cheaper alternative to a shipping container is roll-on, roll-off, where the car is driven onto a giant car carrier ship. This obviously increases the risk of damage for a car that's being exposed to people moving it around, other cars moving around it, but it is going to be the most cost-effective option. I also paid for maritime insurance because I've heard horror stories of containers falling off ships or cars being damaged from loading and unloading. The time it takes from port to port can vary, so ask the shipping company. It's going to be dependent on when there is an available slot on a shared container and where that container is destined to go. For my B3, I actually had the car stored at the port until it hit 25 years old. Once there was a slot in the container destined for the West Coast, it took about 6 weeks for it to get ready for me to pick it up. For my B8, I had to wait 5 weeks before there was a container destined for the East Coast, and it took about 4 weeks from Germany all the way to the East Coast. For the importation side of the equation, there are a few things to keep in mind and to navigate to get the car into the U.S. Number one, keep copies of everything. After the car was exported from Europe and on a ship, the shipping company sent me all of the original documents through FedEx. They would also send copies of these documents to their importing side of the business, stateside. Sometimes things can get lost in the shuffle, so be prepared to provide copies of these documents to the importer again if necessary. The next item are all the government forms that will need to be filled out. There will be 3 sets of forms that need to be filled out. The shipping company will generally help you with these forms, but just to go over this so you're aware, the first form you'll have to fill in is the U.S. Customs Form 7501. This establishes what you're importing and what taxes are owed. Since the car is being imported under the 25-year rule, it's only a 2.5% tariff based on the value of the car or on the bill of sale. The second form is the FMVSS Form HS7. This is to declare that the car is over 25 years old and does not need to meet current crash safety requirements. Then the last form is EPA Form 3520-1. This is to declare that the car is over 21 years old and does not need to meet any of the current emissions requirements. Again, the shipping company will generally help you fill out these forms. Third, something else to consider are U.S. Customs stamps. The U.S. government is trying to go paperless, so they may not issue stamps on physical paperwork anymore. Physical stamps are not required by every state, but make sure you understand whether your state requires this or not. It is possible to try to get this afterwards, but it's going to complicate things, and there may be some costs associated with it as well from the shipping company. Then fourth and lastly, just be aware of all the various fees associated with importation. I talked about the tariff. I taught all the forms may require a processing fee as well, not only from a customs standpoint, but the shipping company to handle it for you. There's also fees associated with the port that the container or the car carrier ship arrives at. There's fees associated with unloading the container and then unloading the car from the container. So don't be surprised if all these fees start to add up in the process. The last fee is related to an importation bond that has to be paid. I don't believe this is avoidable, but it's important to let the shipping company know if you intend to import more than one car in a 12-month period. The costs associated with a single entry or multi-entry bond are different, and if you're bringing in several cars over a 12-month period, you can save a little money with a multi-entry bond. At least that's how it was explained to me. So let's break down the cost of the two cars that I've imported. So the cost to register the car in Europe with the title, get export plates and insurance, very reasonable, and ended up costing under $200 in both instances. The cost of shipping the cars varied greatly because it's dependent on economic conditions and also the method. The cheapest quote I've gotten was $1,200 back in 2020, and this was for roll-on, roll-off. And I've also seen a high of $6,000 for a dedicated container for the car. For my B3, it cost me $1,800 to ship it in 2020 all the way to the West Coast from Germany. For my B8 in 2021, to have it shipped from Germany to the East Coast cost $3,800. Maritime insurance, that will range anywhere from 1% to 2% of the value depending on the shipment company you're using. For the various fees, it ranged from $700 to $1,500. And again, these fees include various documentation fees, port and terminal fees, and customs fees. There's the 2.5% tariff that I talked about before. So to kind of bring this to life, to use two theoretical examples, let's say you purchased a car for $20,000. The export registration insurance for that car is probably going to cost around the $150 range. My guess, based on the economics of today, if you were to go with a roll-on, roll-off shipping, it's probably going to cost about $2,000 to have that car shipped from Germany to the East or West Coast. Insurance will be about 2% of the value of the car. The various fees that I talked about, I'm going to estimate that to be about $1,000. The import tariff of 2.5% is going to work itself out to $500. So for a total of $24,000, you can get a car that is worth $20,000 into the U.S. So when you look at it from that perspective, that's about 20% of the value of the car to get it into the country. And this doesn't even include state registration fees. So that does seem a little steep. Now, if you look at another theoretical example of a maybe more expensive car, let's say you purchased a car for $50,000. Again, the export registration, very reasonable, about $200. The shipping costs, I'm assuming for a more expensive car, you're not going to do roll-on and roll-off. So you're probably going to do a shared container just to manage the cost. So that's going to cost about $4,000. The insurance for that car will be about $1,000. The various fees of unloading the car, since now you're doing a container, adds up to over $1,500. Then the tariff of 2.5%. So all in, you're looking at almost $58,000 to get a car in. And then when you look at it that way, it's only about 14% of the value of the car to get it stateside. I'm not going to go into detail on state titling and registration, as this process varies so greatly. Just be prepared to read and understand your state's process for titling an imported car. Even though a car can be brought into the U.S., your state may have additional requirements for titling and registration. In some situations, it may not be possible to get a car titled in a certain state due to requirements on crash safety certification or state emissions requirements. So even though at a federal level you're allowed to bring the car into the country, it doesn't mean that car qualifies for state titling and registration. Some states may also have various processes for VIN inspection and additional paperwork to establish legal ownership and importation of a car. As I alluded to previously, some states may require paperwork to be physically stamped by U.S. Customs. In Pennsylvania, where I'm from, I had to have the forms stamped. I missed that part and had to have the shipping company go back to U.S. Customs to get the stamp done for my B3, which cost an additional $250. I hope this helped to demystify the process of importing a car into the U.S. The process isn't very difficult for a motivated enthusiast, and importing 2 cars was certainly a learning experience. I imagine it just gets easier to navigate each time around. I'm very fortunate to have had these opportunities to learn the process, and it really opens up an entirely new pool of cars for me to consider in the future. Thanks everyone, and hope you learned something.